Welcome to the official Warrior podcast from Max. I'm Lisa Ling, a journalist and Warrior superfan.
And I'm Hoon Lee. You may know me as the actor who plays Wang Chao, the friend to everyone and Chinese black market salesman. And I'm also a writer on the series. As your hosts, we'll be breaking down every episode of Warrior Season 3, and we'll learn more about how this incredible new season came together through interviews with the creators, cast, and crew. We'll also be discovering the very real historical events and people that inspired the characters and story of Warrior, including Bruce Lee, whose writings inspired the entire series.
So today we're diving into episode 1, which I have just been anticipating for so long. It's entitled Exactly the Wrong Time to Get Proud, written by series creator and showrunner Jonathan Tropper, who is our guest on the podcast today. We're going to talk to him about his approach to adapting Bruce Lee's original treatment into this show that we all love so much. But before we get into that, Hoon, I'm so excited to be sitting across from you. People who are listening to this, we are sitting in a room with headphones on, and every time I look at you, I see Wang Chao's devious face. No offense.
Wow. I mean, thank you.
He's such a mysterious, kind of cunning character.
And the best character on the show. I think we're all in agreement about
absolutely,
that.
Absolutely.
So Lisa, as a self-professed superfan, thank you very much, of our show, I'm curious as to know what your connection is to Bruce Lee, and whether you have a particular moment or history in your life that speaks to you.
Well, I might have a fairly large Bruce Lee action figure collection.
You might. Fascinating.
That I used to display on my wall. They're still in boxes, but when we moved into our new house...
of course they're in boxes.
Of course.
I'm learning so much about you.
Yes, they are my prized collection. You know, until Bruce Lee appeared on the scene, the way Asians and Asian Americans were depicted in the media were really depicted demeaningly. And for the most part, I think Asian men were depicted just as very weak and not sexy. Bruce Lee really shattered all of that. And I've always also been so intrigued by the wisdom that he exuded. And he just resonated with so many people, even outside of the Asian American community, which is something that I've always just admired about him. And so when I found out that his writings inspired the show, I just became obsessed with it. I was so hypercharged when I first started watching seasons 1 and 2 a couple of years ago. And I will say, Hoon, this season is so phenomenal. And I just can't wait for viewers to be able to see it in totality.
That's very kind of you, and you're welcome. No, I'm just kidding. But
thank you.
But you're talking about, the fact that Bruce Lee really embodied that sort of martial arts spirit in the sense that it's not just about the movement and not about the physicality, but also about the philosophy behind it. And he had grown so much in the mind of the audience as a philosopher as well as sort of a Hollywood sensation.
Yeah, and, his daughter Shannon really carries on that incredible legacy. And I got a chance to talk to her for the podcast this season. She is also an executive producer of Warrior, and she really describes some of what you're talking about, Hoon. Here she is.
As hard as he exercised his body, he exercised his mind just as much. And when he had that strength of mind, the ability to quiet the mind, direct the mind, to the creation of what he wanted in his life. That is the thing that I think we all look at and go, oh, he represents some kind of sense of what's possible. And it's because he had this ability to use his energy and express it out in a way that is timeless.
It is absolutely timeless. That's been borne out from the time of his death onwards. And we're going to have more of Shannon in future episodes, so make sure you come back and listen for that. And of course, one of the most sort of famous things and ideas that Bruce Lee has put forth is the idea of trying to be like water. But I'm just curious, is that something that speaks to you? Do you feel like, are there ways that you try to be like water?
Well, I'm going to ask you the same question too, because
Are you?
let's just say that it's a state that I am constantly trying to aspire to achieve. That sort of stillness and the way that water can change and be this really strong force, but also just flow so freely. I would say that I'm constantly aspiring to incorporate more of those properties and characteristics into my own life because I just feel like I'm constantly living in this frenzied state
Right.
where, you know, it's hard to kind of like just sort of calm the body, calm the mind.
Right.
How about you?
You know, one of the things I've been thinking about is how we could apply this to our understanding of society as a whole. And that this is something that maybe a group of people need to do, that a nation needs to do, that a world needs to do, is sort of understand that there's a changing nature that's underpinning everything else. And we're just living through times where as the world shifts, technology moves faster and faster. I do think there's a natural inclination to try to hold fast to something and try to like find that stable part of the world that you can just lock down and say, I understand this. And maybe the answer is really to surrender to it, or surrender to the change more rapidly so that we can be sort of more accommodating about what's going on around us, about other people around us, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it really could be a panacea if we could all kind of adopt that way of thinking.
Yeah.
All right, so now let's talk about Warrior, shall we?
Yes, it's time to get down to business.
So let's talk about episode 1 in season 3.
It's been 2 months since the Chinatown riot, and Chinese businesses are continuously being shut down by the SFPD. The Hopway, led by an erratic Youngjun, are cash-strapped. The Longzi, led by my Ling, are increasing their numbers and their territory. The Tongs worked together in the riot, but now my Ling is trying to expand her territory with opium dens, going against the peace treaty between the Tongs. In the opening scene, Assam channels Bruce Lee as he fights members of the Longzi, including his old opponent, Leong. After the fight breaks up, Sergeant Bill has some words for Assam.
Hey, I was here during that riot trying to keep your people safe.
We don't need you to keep us safe. We need you to stay the hell out of our business.
Tong business.
I mean every business the cops have shut down with these bullshit ordinances. People are starving.
And how are your turf wars gonna feed them?
My Ling meets with acting Mayor Buckley. Buckley is annoyed she's broken their previous agreement and is blackmailing him with an incriminating photo about his past as a Confederate soldier. Kong Pak's Tong merges with the Longzi, and he joins My Ling's Council of Elders at Leong's urging. Atoy has been spending less time in Chinatown and more time on the vineyard in Sonoma with Nellie, where they house and employ women who have escaped the Chinatown sex trade. In the end, Chao leads Youngjun, Assam, and Hong to counterfeiting plates, hatching a new plan.
Well, let's talk about Wang Chao.
My favorite topic.
Our favorite character. So he gives some white society ladies a tour of Chinatown and puts a white lady in her place with his characteristic blend of seriousness and humor.
Yeah.
And then he introduces them to My Ling.
Please meet My Ling, very successful businesswoman in Chinatown.
Oh my, she's really beautiful. Thank you. So are you. Would you like to come inside and have some tea? I've just finished renovating, and it's been ages since I've had any guests.
You speak like an American.
When in Rome. Please, come in.
And My Ling entertains the women in her home, hoping that her power and influence can grow beyond Chinatown. Leong is suspect of this.
I just don't like the way they look at you.
They're fascinated with us. If I can gain their trust, I can make them see us as people to do business with. Chinatown is getting smaller. We need to expand beyond it. Out in the pond, not everyone hates us.
They'll never treat us as equals.
No, but the ducks are greedy. And our money is as good as anyone else's.
There's a couple different layers to that perspective. From My Ling's side, for example, we're looking at someone taking a real risk, extending beyond what is known in Chinatown is something that has never been particularly fruitful for anybody from Chinatown. And here she is not only trying to extend business, but trying to establish social connections outside of it. She's doing what seems very smart. She's leveraging the abilities and capabilities that she has, her own background, her grasp of the language, in order to make a move that not everyone can do. And in doing so, she's starting to create a little bit of a distance between what Leong is sort of capable of helping her with, because he doesn't speak the language, for example. So when he says, I don't like how they look at you, they'll never treat us as equals, it's a demonstration not only of his sort of his traditionalism in a way, but also sort of his growing concern that he's not going to be able to help her or assist her in the way that he is used to. This is one of these ways that the change that exists in the whole season starts to trickle down to every facet of how the characters interact with each other.
Well, and this also just shows Mai Ling's ambition to,
Yes.
for her reach to extend beyond Chinatown.
And you know what's I think is really lovely is when you first meet her in the series again with Kong Pak, she's in full like regalia. She's in queen mode, you know. She's in full Beyonce mode.
Oh yeah,
and like
stunning.
And she is like, you know, absorbing this new Tong. She's welcoming them in, but this is an official capacity. In this discussion with the ladies, we start to understand a different aspect of her skill set, that she can be charming, that she can be revelatory in order to achieve a purpose, and that those things aren't necessarily at odds with each other, that she's not being disingenuous when she's being open, even if she's also being manipulative, that these things aren't necessarily divided issues for her.
I just have to quickly ask you about Youngjun, because Assam and Wang Chao, they discuss Assam's relationship to Mai Ling and how it's really starting to make Youngjun really nervous and suspicious.
Yeah.
Chao, I am loyal to the Tong.
You crossed the salt to find her.
And she ordered my death.
Family can be complicated. Look, if you ask me,
I didn't.
I don't see you moving against your own sister, and neither does Youngjun. You've got to keep an eye on him. He's not his father. He goes off the wrong way, he could bring down the whole Tong.
Youngjun has a very complex relationship with family. And so when we first come to Youngjun and Assam getting together as friends in the first season, you know, Youngjun is looking for a brother. Youngjun is looking for found family. And he has such conflict and such strife with his natural father that we understand that this is a part of his psychology, et cetera. So Assam is really important to him. But because he has this sort of deep tie to his family, he understands that the blood relationship is actually super important as well. So I think he's constantly wrestling with his desire to fully engage, fully trust with Assam, and his suspicion that blood may be thicker than their friendship. And this is a central thematic for Youngjun through the season. And there's a lot of really flat ways to play that. And I think Jason avoided all of those traps, which was just great to see. And as a fan, I'm so pleased to see it as well. And it's so exciting. And that goes to Andrew as well, because Andrew has to play this character that if we believe that he is 100% behind one or the other, there's no actual drama. And so they are constantly working this tightrope of falling into one camp or falling into the other.
Yeah, that conflict is just so palpable.
Yeah, and I think we all feel stuff like this, right? There's found family and there's blood relations, and sometimes those things are at odds.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think this is the perfect moment to welcome the incomparable Jonathan Tropper. As I mentioned earlier, Jonathan is the series creator and showrunner of Warrior. He's also a prolific screenwriter and best-selling author of 6 novels. His last 2 novels, This Is Where I Leave You and One Last Thing Before I Go, were both New York Times bestsellers, and he is the co-creator and executive producer of the Cinemax television series Banshee, where he also worked with Hoon.
Yes, we go back a ways. We have a long, dark, sordid history. I'm so glad we're going to talk about it.
Welcome, Jonathan. Congratulations on Warrior finding a new home.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. This is very exciting.
I should actually congratulate all the fans, too, because we all have just been so eagerly anticipating season 3. So I just have to ask you, you know, it's part of this infamous lore of Warrior that Shannon Lee discovered Bruce Lee's original treatment for the series after her father's death. And it was this 8-page overview of his concept for Warrior. And it only had 4 characters. First of all, is this true? And does this document exist?
Yeah, it does exist. And I read 2 documents. I read the 8-page Bruce Lee document and then a kind of 5-page computer typewritten synopsis that Shannon had created around her father's pages. But yeah, it was 8 pages. It actually had illustrations as well. And that led me into a deep dive that, ultimately gave us the framework to create the show.
And Jonathan, first of all, just take us back. What was that like to actually read Bruce Lee's writings? I mean, did he mean anything to you throughout your life? When did you know this could be a series?
Here we go.
It was a very surreal moment because as a little kid, I discovered Bruce Lee watching the Sunday afternoon movies and on my local TV network. It was called the Big Apple Movie, and it was every Sunday at like 4 or 5 o'clock. And that's where I first saw Way of the Dragon. Although when they were airing it, it was called Return of the Dragon. And I was like also a young martial arts student at that time, and then watching this guy who moved like that and who clearly was sort of a cut above every other sort of gung fu theater thing I'd ever seen was super exciting. And then it became a game of trying to get Enter the Dragon from our local video store. It was never in. And I spent really, like, every time I'd go to the video, I've seen so many movies because Enter the Dragon wasn't in. And then finally that exciting day when Enter the Dragon was in. And of course, our video store only had 1 copy. And I took it home and watched it about 1,000 times. And you could tell because the video was so worn. Like there were parts in the video where everything got pixelated because that video had been played so much. But yeah, also I was a martial arts student from about age 11 into adulthood. And so, Bruce Lee was always sort of this gold standard of movement and discipline. Plus he was a cultural icon, having grown up in, the late 70s and the 80s, his face was everywhere. So it was incredibly exciting to sort of sit down in Shannon's office where like she just blithely handed me the nunchucks from Way of the Dragon to spin around. And, and there were all these pieces of paraphernalia everywhere. And then she took out this bound notebook that had his handwriting and this stuff written in it. And I kind of knew even before I really knew what I was going to do that there was no way I was going to pass up the opportunity.
I mean, what I think is so brilliant about the series is how you have been able to fuse this period in history in the 1800s in America when the Chinese came over to work in the gold rush and the railroads with Bruce Lee's style of martial arts like that, and make it so seamless, really.
Well, that was really my whole goal starting out was I don't want to make the Merchant Ivory version of this. From the get-go, I embraced a kind of graphic novel aesthetic to the storytelling, which wasn't just the visuals, but also, we were going to be historically accurate kind of thematically, but not actually. So we gave ourselves license to sort of take little bits of history and move them into slightly other years and to sort of dress the Hopway and the Longzi, like they're in some kind of, the Longzi look like they're in some kind of post-apocalyptic movie. And, the Hopway are wearing Armani suits. And just to really stylize the whole thing, because I think, what made Bruce Lee break through, in my opinion, obviously there's his fluidity and there's his charisma, but there's swagger. And that was a word that I threw around a lot when we were developing the show, was the whole show has to have swagger. It has to feel like we're here to really enjoy the entire ethos of Bruce Lee. And that's like, it's great technique, it's great martial arts, it's having a very serious underpinning of something socially and culturally important. And at the same time, there's always got to be a little bit of a wink at the camera. And that's sort of how we developed the whole ethos of the show.
And I remember you talking also about a sense of like knowing, like a show knowing what it is, like knowing its identity, and that's part of him as well, right? He's so singular as an icon.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that word swagger, because I first came to the show when it went to Max. And it was during a time when violence against Asians had been increasing since COVID became rooted in this country and around the world. And so to see these Asian men with that swagger, right, it was a very validating feeling for someone like me at that time. So I appreciate that was such a core component of what you wanted to achieve here.
That's also important because, as I think for the community that was, hurting, it's this sort of cathartic thing that you can turn to. And, it's not just a fantasy escape, but it allows you to sort of see an expression of some of the emotion you're pent up, holding and harboring. So,
Absolutely.
And obviously, when we were developing this, it was before Trump was president. It was before immigration became a hot button topic again. And it was before that real visible spike in those hate crimes, because those were really born out of the pandemic. And we were developing this before that, obviously. But what was really important to Justin was the way he felt, the Asian American characters had been portrayed for his entire life in American cinema was as sort of sexless, one-dimensional characters. And he wanted them to be written the way you'd be writing white characters. He wanted them, to be flawed. He wanted them to fuck. He wanted them, to be sexual. He wanted them to be angry. He wanted them to run the entire gamut of human emotion because he felt that was something that was, missing from genre and from regular television when it came to Asian American casting. And so that was like his, I think, number one objective in making the show.
So how much did you delve into the history of the times?
The hard part was there's very little available online. There was really not a lot from that period available. The combination of the fire in the early 1900s in Chinatown, which erased a lot of records, and the fact that the Chinese Americans didn't do a ton of record keeping at that time. And the American history didn't record what was going on in Chinatown. It's exactly the kind of thing I generally hate to do, which is a sprawling research project. So it was sort of a gradual absorption of information. It was just it was a real immersion, but it happened sort of painlessly because it happened over time.
And it ended up being hugely helpful to us because they passed that research material on to us. And, one of the things we're wrestling with now is we don't get taught our own history
That's right.
in the country. So, it's new for us too. And we couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe some of the things that we were learning about before we went into the show. And it was a massive boon.
That's right. I mean, I went through my entire educational life without learning about a single Asian American who had contributed anything to this country.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I was out of high school and I had to start digging myself that I even learned much about the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Right. Or like the number of Japanese American people who never learned about internment when they were growing up, that sort of thing. Yeah.
That's right. I wonder if you can take us into the writer's room for a moment. How do you approach the balance of historical accuracy versus the overall narrative for the characters and the time period?
So what we'll usually do is we'll come in with a number of big historical signposts that we want to address. Like in season 2, we had read about the various riots that had happened in Chinatowns up and down the coast, and we wanted to do a riot, and we wanted to sort of explore all of the political and social and personal effects of a riot in Chinatown. So we came into the room, with articles on the various riots and people reading up on the riots. It kind of works that way. And then, what we also have is we have a good amount, we have Asian American writers in the rooms who sort of can tell their own stories about grandparents and parents and the way, they've heard about stories. But we largely, once we've done that, once we've sort of laid down the big signposts, we then get really into character and we work on a lot of sort of story points that will just take the characters on the arcs we want them in. And then during that process, people will bring up, hey, you're talking about getting them in trouble here. Well, I read that, 2 miles outside of San Francisco, there was once this outpost where this happened. And, people would feed in there, some writers more than others would feed in as we were developing story. Hey, that plays into something I read in The Hatchetman, and that plays into this article I read, because a lot of the writers did a lot of their own research too. In terms of accuracy, we never wanted to do something that flew in the face of anything that had happened, but we might definitely take an incident that happened in New York in 1905 and put it in San Francisco in 1879, just because we want to tell thematically what was going on in these Chinatowns, but we're not necessarily bound. And I think it's really clear when you watch the show that we're not planting our flag in historical accuracy.
Martial arts is at the core of this show, and
Yeah.
many publications have said it's the best martial arts show ever on television.
They're not wrong.
They are not wrong. No way.
That's what I said. That's what I said.
We're spending too much time together.
Oh, good Lord.
This is so true.
Obviously, with Bruce Lee's name on the show, we knew we had to have the best fights on television. So those were not afterthoughts. We worked incredibly hard on that. We got Brett Chan, who's a real, not just an expert in martial arts and in TV martial arts, but also really understands Bruce Lee's martial art.
Mm-hmm.
And, we talked a lot about it not looking pretty and not looking inconsequential like a lot of shows, whether it's Marvel shows or whether it's the actual, network shows that had Kung Fu, where it always looks really pretty and sort of Power Rangery or somewhere between Crouching Tiger and the Power Rangers. And we want everything to feel like a street fight and to feel really visceral and hard. And we want to find the beauty of the martial arts, but at the same time, what makes these fights really work is that, they really fucking hurt. And that's, what's really important. You don't hit somebody with 50 spinning kicks and they're still standing there. We don't do it that way.
I want to talk about the women in Warrior. I have to be honest, when I first started watching season 1, I was unnerved seeing women in such compromising positions and, in the sort of hypersexualized roles that they were in. But it's been incredible to see the evolution of these characters, particularly Atoy. I mean, she becomes just this fierce and ferocious champion of women. And I wonder how you have thought about the evolution of the women in the series.
It was always our intention that there be, at least in the first 2 seasons, things have shifted a bit in season 3, but in the first season, there were 3 bases of power. There was Ling, there was Atoy, and there was Penny. Penelope Blake, the mayor's wife. And it was always our intention, we wanted to subvert a trope, right? And, the trope of, the 19th century white wife, of the politician, the trope of the Chinese prostitute, right? And the trope of all the sexualized Chinese women, immigrating to the United States. And so the idea was to first set them up in the positions you expected them to be in. And then, over the course of that first season, completely subvert that trope. That was something else that Shannon and Justin, were very passionate about, was to subvert those tropes. I think the intention was always to show that, to do something anachronistic, the same way the hot boy suits are anachronistic, women of this time period assuming, significant power bases, sometimes, in a world where the deck is stacked against them, like the fact that Penny Blake ends up, running her father's business, and Ling is able to basically become the head of a tong, and Atoy is this assassin who's also fighting she's a sex trafficker, but she's also fighting for social justice.
I have to say that I love how you've developed the women in this series, and Atoy's character is she is incredible, and Olivia plays her so brilliantly, and she lights up the screen, and I love how you've developed them.
Thanks.
I was personally really happy that they were willing to sort of take that chance. There's so many instances where an immediate gratification is required, but the idea of allowing the show to set it up so that it could undercut it, that was great, because it's not nearly as effective if you don't do that, right? Because you're playing on the audience's native perceptions, forcing them to look at them.
That's right. And it was hard at first.
Yeah.
But I would also tell you, if you go to Atoy basically across 3 seasons, has, just in the pilot, she has a sex scene with Koji. And that's where you're sort of setting up that usual expectation of exploitation, right? But the goal actually in that scene, in addition to just setting up an expectation that we were going to subvert, that if you watch that scene, it's actually carefully constructed to create just as much nudity on Koji as there is on Olivia. And the idea there, which was something we really talked about, was that, again, Justin wanted his Chinese lead, his Asian lead, to be sexy. And he wanted him to have a sex scene. And so there's a purposeful move to camera when he embraces her, where we go to the other camera. So you're not seeing her behind, you're seeing his behind. And he's lying down on top of her. And it was done very consciously to sort of even the playing field and create a sense of the Asian American lead as a sexual person.
Oh, I remember in vivid detail.
So that was something that had been talked about a lot, just in terms of like where we wanted to go with the show and how we had to start out.
Well, I appreciate that was that came at the insistence of Justin, because
Yeah.
it is very rare that we have seen Asian men in that kind of a sexual role. And so, yeah, that was a particularly exciting scene for me to watch.
I mean, all of which is in service of saying, right, like if there is a trope that emerges, the real danger of representing a person as a prostitute or a criminal or a gangster, et cetera, is that when that is all that is presented, when that is the extent of their humanity, right? And so I think that's the effort being put forth all the time, is to say, like, these are complex people. They have deep problems. They're deeply flawed because they're human.
Well, and that it also extends to all the Irishmen.
Exactly right.
In the cast as well. I mean, that's another thing that I really appreciate, is that there is no intrinsically good guy or bad guy. I mean, everyone has a motivation for their actions.
You just made Jonathan so happy.
Well, no, I
with
mean,
that
you humanize.
That's the speech I give.
That's the speech
I give. Four seasons of Banshee, 3 seasons of Warrior. My other show also is that there are no good guys and bad guys. The only thing you have to know is nobody's innocent.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And you humanize everyone and really understand what motivates them to think what they think and do what they do. And I think that is really the beauty of this show, even beyond the bells and whistles, right? It's just exploring the humanity of all the characters. In this episode, Ling is trying to expand her influence beyond Chinatown. She's networking with white society ladies who visit her home. And there's a moment when they note that she speaks like an American. Now, she and her brother are the only Chinese characters who don't speak with accents when speaking to non-Chinese people. But most of the time, we hear the characters speaking without accents to each other. In the world of the show, perfect English becomes a proxy for Cantonese. How did that come about? I mean, I think that the way you use language in this show, I haven't seen it used like this anywhere else. And I think it's just brilliant.
Well, I don't think we're the only ones. I'd have to, when we talked about doing that, we actually referenced The Hunt for Red October and the opening scene where Sean Connery is speaking in Russian. And then, as the camera comes around, he speaks English. And then you hear him in English for the rest of the film, but you understand he's speaking Russian. So we didn't invent the conceit. But what we did for our show was we wanted, because we were making the show, ostensibly for an American audience, we didn't want there to be any barrier between the Asian cast and the Americans viewing, because we wanted them to relate to the Asian cast and not just think, oh, now we're switching to the white people, so we'll relate to that, and the Asians are the mysterious Asians in Chinatown. But the notion was that they are the same as us, and you're hearing them speak and you're hearing them talk, and you're sucked into their world because it's their show. And then the fun of that is if there's ever a non-Asian person present, they're hearing it differently. They're hearing the Cantonese. And what that also did on a subliminal level, which is a lot of fun, is it almost creates the sense when it's Wang Chao or when it's Olivia. And I think Wang Chao and Olivia are pretty much the only two that speak English, broken English, well enough to speak to the white people, except when Koji's pretending. But the notion you get is almost like it's trickery. Mm-hmm. Right? Like you almost feel like, oh, Chow could speak regularly, but he's putting on his broken accent because that's part of how he disarms, white America. When in fact, it's just the conceit for the language, but it adds this extra level of there's a little bit of trickery going on as well. And I think it just makes you feel much closer to the characters because you hear them speaking the way you would speak. instead of, because to most people who don't know Cantonese and who aren't familiar with the language, it feels incredibly indecipherable and inscrutable. And we wanted to make sure there was no sense of that anywhere on the show.
Well, it's almost like the characters are almost putting on a bit of a show when they're interacting with white people. By switching over to that broken English.
Right.
It's almost like you're sort of playing them a little bit.
Well, one of the things that's interesting as someone performing that is that you very much get a vivid sense of how your voice and your accent, or lack thereof, almost frames a different person for the person you're interacting with, right? Like, so when I think about my real life and I encounter someone who has an accent, I think about this show and I'm like, what if I understood them natively? What impression would they give me? Because I'm only getting the impression based in the frame of my English American speaking voice and how they differ from that, right? So I've really enjoyed the fact that when the Chinese characters are speaking, they're speaking in their quote unquote true voice. They're speaking with their true intent and they're like in the most easily understood way, and that we add this layer of sort of obfuscation when they're in an accent. And by doing that, you're seeing how you might perceive them differently if you encountered them in the street. Like, what assumption would you make?
Yeah.
And Hoon, your character in particular, what you do really well is when Chao is speaking, to people in Chinatown, he has a sharpness and a gravity to him. There's something, he is sort of recognizing the dangers to Chinatown, the dangers to each other, and he speaks about really serious issues in very grave tones. Mm-hmm. Then when he speaks to like Bill or Lee, he's not just speaking in broken English, but he's also sounding a little bit like your drunk uncle.
Right. Yes.
And he puts on this kind of almost cheerful, goofy voice while he's talking to them, and that's his way of seeming unthreatening to them and seeming, it's a way of disarming them so he can get what he needs. And it's and then there's always those fun moments where he, even in the broken English, allows his true self to slip through, like when he, talks to Lee and says something a little bit threatening, or, he makes an offhanded comment to Bill that says, I've got shit on you. And like, it's fun watching him slip from the drunk uncle to, I'm up here being the drunk uncle, but don't fuck with me.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's the drunk uncle, but he's also kind of winking at you.
Or the drunkle.
Yeah.
The drunkle.
Yes.
Like, I'm a hell of a lot smarter than these people think I am.
And I remember Jonathan talking about the story is an American story, and so that the language between the Chinese people, it's that speaking to the idea of not creating a filter for the audience, right? This is fundamentally a story about Americans.
Yes.
People becoming Americans.
That's such an important distinction.
Yeah.
Well, Jonathan, again, thank you so much for being here and for creating this just sensational ass-kicking show that I know everyone is just going to be so elated and excited to see.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Jonathan. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. All right, that's it for us. Until next time.
We'd like to thank Jonathan Tropper for joining us today and for employing me for 8 years.
That's right. Join us next time where we discuss episode 2 and talk about what goes into Warrior's incredible fight scenes with series stunt and fight coordinator Brett Chan.
We're back with a new podcast after every new episode of Warrior, so come back for more as soon as you've watched episode 2.
Yes, we'll see you soon. Stream new episodes of Warrior Thursdays only on Max, and listen to this incredible podcast on Max and wherever you listen to podcasts.
The Official Warrior Podcast is a Max podcast produced by the Mashup Americans. It is executive produced by Amy S. Choi and Rebecca Lehrer. Our producers are Sarah Pellegrini and Thomas Liu. Our development producer is Nicole Kelly. Our production manager is Shelby Sandlin. The show is mixed by Pedro Rafael Rosado.